Tonight we begin with an announcement that transportation officials had predicted, advocacy groups had feared, and millions of American seniors had dismissed as mere rumor, a policy shift that unfolded not over years of gradual implementation, but in a single press conference that will affect over 50 million licensed drivers, a single press conference that could strip independence from countless families, a single press conference that has seniors across the nation asking one simple question: can I still drive? What the Department of Transportation announced today crossed a line that senior advocacy groups had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, organizations like AARP did not hesitate. They responded with urgency, with outrage, and with a promise to fight back. But before we get to the response, you need to understand exactly what was announced, why it matters, and what it means for you or someone you love. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal proposals, just signals that federal and state transportation authorities were preparing something unprecedented. The Department of Transportation has been cautious, yes, but they have been deliberate in their caution. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a rhythm, that those who watch transportation policy could predict. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and state capitals this winter was that the pattern went silent. Insiders who monitor legislative activity know the indicators: the sudden scheduling of closed-door committee meetings, the quiet consultations with medical associations, the polling of public sentiment on senior driving safety, the sudden withdrawal of earlier milder proposals. All of that went quiet. And whenever federal regulators go quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior advocacy groups had been tracking rumors since early 2024 that a comprehensive overhaul of senior driving requirements was in development. But without concrete evidence, they could only prepare, not act. That changed this morning, early this morning. The Department of Transportation released what they described as a comprehensive framework for senior driver safety assessment, including mandatory provisions that had not been enacted at the federal level. In over 40 years, these are the kinds of regulations that the federal government only implements when they are signaling something very specific: a fundamental shift in how we view senior mobility, a response to mounting accident statistics, or a complete restructuring of licensing requirements. Nationwide, observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Washington was changing its approach to senior driving. And when federal regulators shift policy without years of public debate, even by small measures, every American over 65 pays attention. Here's what we now know about the new rules, set to take effect in February 2026. First, mandatory cognitive screening for all license renewals. Beginning at age 65, this isn't a simple vision test. This is a comprehensive assessment designed to evaluate reaction time, memory, and decision-making ability. Second, reduced renewal periods. Instead of renewing every 8 years, seniors 65 to 74 will renew every 4 years. Those 75 and older will renew every 2 years. Third, mandatory road tests for anyone over 70 who has been involved in any at-fault accident, regardless of severity. Fourth, physician reporting requirements that will require doctors to notify the DMV if they believe a patient poses a driving risk. These provisions represent the most sweeping changes to senior driving requirements in American history. The statement issued by AARP tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Spokesperson after spokesperson described the DOT's announcement as discriminatory, overreaching, and perhaps most importantly, a solution looking for a problem that data doesn't support. But policy only works if the affected population accepts it quietly. Seniors did not. In fact, their response today was among the most organized and immediate we've seen in advocacy history. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the announcement, AARP activated its legal team to challenge the constitutionality of age-based testing requirements. These weren't routine objections. These were constitutional challenges, legal strategies that advocacy groups only deploy when they are preparing to fight a policy. All the way to the Supreme Court, senior citizen organizations across all 50 states began mobilizing phone banks, email campaigns, and protest schedules. This wasn't passive resistance. This was organized opposition. Tonight, transportation analysts confirmed that the new framework targets specific driving behaviors, including intersection navigation, that had recently been identified as the leading cause of senior-involved accidents. In a controversial study, the Dowdy acted before advocacy groups could mount a preemptive legal challenge. They targeted cognitive function. They targeted reaction time. They targeted renewal frequency. That would generate billions in new testing fees. In other words, the DOT targeted every aspect of senior driving that could be quantified, measured, and used as justification for license denial. The testing component that would make it enforceable. This is what made AARP's response so urgent. The DOT's announcement wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of policy shift that could remove millions of seniors from the roads if left unchallenged. And senior advocates, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't attack the safety premise. They didn't deny that some seniors shouldn't drive. They attacked the implementation. They attacked the age-based discrimination. They pointed out that a 65-year-old with perfect health would face restrictions that a 64-year-old with documented impairments would not. The illogic of arbitrary age cutoffs became their primary weapon. And here's where the story becomes even more concerning. Policy analysts now believe that the DOT's announcement was designed to test the political viability of senior driving restrictions. After years of advocacy group dominance on this issue, the DOT wanted to see whether seniors would accept incremental restrictions without significant pushback. But instead, the opposite happened. AARP and allied organizations didn't accept the premise that they launched a counteroffensive that was so swift, so comprehensive that even Washington insiders noticed. You don't get Washington's attention easily, but today's senior advocates did. Transportation policy experts, speaking with major news outlets under anonymity, describe the DOT's approach as strategic overreach, a way to establish a negotiating position that would make lesser restrictions seem reasonable by comparison. But advocates proved today that they remain both vigilant and capable. Their legal challenges were not only immediate, they were targeted so precisely that they addressed each provision individually, rather than the framework as a whole. That approach matters because it shows sophisticated legal strategy. It shows that senior advocates are not passive recipients of policy. They are active shapers of transportation law. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon, we learned more about the scale of the advocacy. Response: AARP filed preliminary injunction requests in 3 federal courts, forcing the DOT to defend the policy. Before implementation, state-level senior organizations targeted governors who had voiced support for the federal framework. In the last 2 weeks, medical associations operating independently reportedly questioned the scientific validity of cognitive tests used by the DOT to justify the requirements. This wasn't just complaint letters. This wasn't just public statements. This was coordinated legal action. This was political pressure. And political pressure is the one thing the DOT has struggled to withstand since the last administration's failed attempt at similar regulations. For every advance they have made towards senior driving restrictions, advocacy groups have countered with something that complicated implementation. The numbers tell the story. 50 million licensed drivers over 65, an estimated 8 million, who would likely fail initial cognitive screenings based on current test parameters. Billions of dollars in testing fees that states would collect. Countless families who would lose their independence. These aren't abstract statistics. These are your parents, your grandparents, perhaps even you. Remember, the thought seniors would accept restrictions. If packaged as safety measures, they thought advocacy groups had weakened. Since the 2019 reform efforts, they thought the current political climate favored regulatory expansion. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Seniors are organized like never before. Advocacy groups have more resources than previous years. The political climate is increasingly hostile to what many see as government overreach. The timing of this announcement, just weeks before major elections, suggests the underestimated just how politically explosive this issue would become. What makes this moment so significant and so personal is that the DOT's announcement happened at a time when the Transportation Secretary is under immense political pressure. Safety advocates want stricter senior driving regulations. Rural legislators want exemptions for areas without public transportation. Medical associations want clarity on physician liability. Civil liberties groups want age discrimination protections. The Secretary is balancing these demands while facing a Congress increasingly hostile to new regulations. And when officials in that position make sudden announcements, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. That vulnerability is exactly what senior advocates plan to exploit. The statement, now distributed across every news outlet in America, was designed to signal that the federal government is not willing to accept current senior accident rates. Officials said plainly that the current state-by-state approach was inconsistent with national safety standards. That is bureaucratic language for, we're taking control away from states, and seniors will feel the impact. You don't usually hear that tone from transportation officials unless something serious is at stake, and something is. Insurance companies have lobbied for years for stricter senior driving requirements. They've funded studies, they've supported advocacy, and they've donated heavily to campaigns of legislators who support these measures. Follow the money and you'll understand the timing. Meanwhile, AARP CEO addressed members in a direct, impassioned video message tonight. She said this is not about safety. This is about discrimination. Dressed in the language of protection, she said we will fight this in every court, in every legislature, and in every voting booth. And she said our members built this country. They will not be pushed off its roads without a fight. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an organization that understands just how high the stakes have become. 50 million members, billions in resources, and a single unified message, not without a fight. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The announcement wasn't isolated. Along with the federal framework, several state legislatures also introduced companion legislation that would exceed federal minimums. Insurance industry groups announced support for even stricter measures. Medical associations increased lobbying for liability protections, targeting physicians who failed to report impaired drivers. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When federal agencies move multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway, a coordinated effort to fundamentally reshape how America's seniors interact with their most basic form of independence, their automobiles, transportation. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the is preparing full implementation, regardless of opposition. Another is that the is attempting to establish a negotiating baseline for compromise legislation. A third possibility, the one worrying advocates the most, is that the is attempting to create precedent that could later expand to other age groups or conditions. But today, senior advocates took that card off the table. They didn't wait for implementation. They didn't negotiate from weakness. They didn't accept the safety premise without challenge. They attacked immediately, comprehensively, and with every resource at their disposal. What we're watching now is a test of political will. The dot wants to see whether seniors will accept restrictions. Incrementally, advocacy groups want to show that any age-based driving restriction will face maximum resistance. State governments want to prevent federal overreach into traditional state authority, and insurance companies want to prevent any outcome that increases their liability exposure. The next 60 days will determine which coalition prevails. Tonight, we've heard from congressional sources who are now monitoring the situation hour by hour. They say the Senate Transportation Committee has scheduled emergency hearings. They say the House is considering legislation that would block federal funding for implementation. And they say the DOT's decision to announce now is likely part of a broader strategy intended to force action before the political calendar makes new regulations impossible. But senior advocates are not retreating. In fact, senior advocates are advancing their response. Today, organized, immediate, and uncompromising, sent a message to the dot that this fight is just beginning. And it sent a message to Congress that 50 million voters are watching as the week goes on. We expect more details to emerge about what exactly the dot hoped to achieve with this timing. But what we do know is that AARP's response was timely. It prevented narrative control by the dot. It established legal challenges before implementation could begin. And it reminded Washington that seniors remain the most reliable voting bloc in America. What happens next will depend on what the dot does in the next 30 days. If they retreat, this moment will be remembered as the high watermark of federal overreach. On senior driving, if they advance, advocacy groups have already shown they are fully mobilized. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in decades, the Department of Transportation appears to be reconsidering. Washington is quiet to quiet. And when regulators are quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight the DOT learned something they should have known already. Seniors vote, seniors organize, and seniors do not surrender their independence. Without a fight, this story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The battle for senior driving rights has officially begun. The stakes could not be higher. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.